Long before the Templars rode into legend, a darker tale was buried beneath the soil of Europe. A royal bloodline whispered to carry the seed of the divine. Who were the Merovingians, and what secret did they take to their silent graves? It is not just the story of a lost dynasty, it is the unraveling of a question that has haunted historians, conspiracists, and secret societies alike. What if the bloodline never ended? In the shadowed centuries between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, there lived a dynasty of rulers who claimed divine blood, governed vast swaths of Western Europe, and planted the first true seeds of medieval Christendom. They ruled not from marble palaces, but from wooden halls and fortified villas scattered across the lands of Gaul. Their name, once uttered with awe and reverence, has nearly vanished from modern memory. But the Merovingians, known to their contemporaries as the long-haired kings, were the first to forge order from the ruins of Roman collapse. They were more than monarchs. They were symbols of continuity, chaos, and transformation. The Merovingians emerged in the wake of empire, as the Western Roman Empire collapsed under the weight of internal corruption, foreign incursions, and economic fragmentation. Roman Gaul, modern-day France, and parts of Belgium and Western Germany descended into uncertainty. In this vacuum rose the Franks, a confederation of Germanic tribes who had once skirted Rome's borders as foederati hired to guard imperial frontiers. But as Roman control weakened, these tribal groups seized land, power, and opportunity. By the late 5th century, the Franks were divided into competing clans, each led by a war chief or petty king. Among these leaders was Childeric I, a tribal ruler of Salian Franks. Little is known of Childeric's reign, but his tomb discovered in 1653 in Tournai, Belgium, revealed a burial rich in symbols of both Frankish warrior culture and Roman. Imperial influence, gold coins, signet rings, weapons, and even Roman-style regalia. But it was his son Clovis I who would elevate the Merovingian name to enduring power. Clovis, born around 466 AD, ascended as king of the Salian Franks in 481 at the age of 15. At the time, Roman Gaul was a patchwork of fading Roman authority, Visigothic power in the south, and Burgundian rule along the Rhine. Through a combination of shrewd alliances, brutal military campaigns, and opportunistic diplomacy, Clovis waged war on his rivals not merely to expand territory, but to consolidate Frankish identity under a single banner. His first decisive victory came in 486 at the Battle of Soissons, where he defeated Syagrius, the last Roman military commander in Gaul. With this, Clovis absorbed the last vestige of Roman rule in northern Gaul and began to style himself not just as a tribal king, but as the heir to Roman authority. This move was not simply political, it was symbolic. Clovis began to weave Roman governance with Germanic tribal law, fusing two worlds in a manner that foreshadowed medieval kingship. But Clovis's most consequential act was not martial light, was spiritual. Around 496 AD, after marrying Clotilde, a Catholic Burgundian princess, Clovis converted from paganism to Nicene Christianity. According to Gregory of Tours, Clovis's conversion occurred during a critical battle against the Alemanni. As defeat loomed, Clovis is said to have prayed to the Christian God for victory and emerged triumphant. Whether this event unfolded exactly as described remains debated. But the political impact of his baptism cannot be overstated. In an era where most Germanic rulers, including the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, adhered to Arian Christianity, a doctrine deemed heretical by the Roman Church, Clovis's embrace of Nicene orthodoxy positioned him as a favored son of the Catholic clergy. 8. Earned him the blessing of Rome and the allegiance of Gallo-Roman bishops, many of whom had maintained their influence despite the empire's collapse. Clovis's baptism in Reims by Saint Remigius symbolized the birth of Catholic France and the Church's alignment with secular power. This act marked the Merovingians not just as conquerors, but as anointed rulers. They were no longer just tribal chieftains. They were divinely sanctioned monarchs in a Christian kingdom. The dynasty Clovis founded would stretch for nearly 250 years. His sons and grandsons expanded Frankish domains across Gaul, consolidating lands once divided among rival tribes and foreign rulers. The Merovingian kings presided over an evolving realm that mixed Roman administrative traditions with Frankish tribal law, Latin with Frankish tongue, and Christian orthodoxy with pagan customs. But with greatness came complexity. Merovingian succession was not primogeniture rule, did not automatically pass to the eldest son. Instead, kingdoms were divided among male heirs, resulting in cycles of civil war, betrayal, and fratricide. The dynasty's later history is littered with intrigue, brothers turned against brothers, queens poisoned rivals. Powerful mayors of the palace, initially mere administrators, grew in influence, eventually eclipsing the kings themselves. Yet through this chaos, the Merovingian image endured. Their long hair, worn by male royalty, was not mere fashion. Symbolized divine right. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of his legitimacy, an act equal to abdication or betrayal. Their tombs, adorned with grave goods and ornate jewelry, reflect a vision of kingship that fused Germanic warrior ideals with Roman imperial splendor and Christian piety. They were kings who ruled not just by sword or bloodline, but by myth. By the 6th and 7th centuries, their name had acquired a legendary quality. Some claimed descent from a sea creature, Quinator-invoking half-Tovine lineage. Others whispered that Merovingian kings had mystical powers or secret knowledge, inherited from ancient pagan rites. Much of this mythologizing emerged centuries later, fueled by chroniclers, poets, and much more recently novelists and conspiracy theorists. Still, even during their reign, the Merovingians straddled the line between history and legend. The Christian Church embraced them as protectors of the faith, yet their pagan roots never quite vanished, in architecture, law, language, and spiritual life. They presided over a world in transition, a post-Roman age, not yet fully medieval. They were stewards of a broken empire's legacy, tasked with reshaping it into something new. By the mid-8th century, however, their power had waned. The real authority lay increasingly with the mayors of the palace, chief administrators who governed in the king's name. In 751, Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, with papal approval. The dynasty that had ruled for over 2 centuries ended quietly. Its last monarch, tonsured, symbolically stripped of divine right, and confined to a monastery. The Carolingians would rise in their place, ushering in a new age of empire and church power. But the Merovingians, forgotten by most, laid the foundation. They bridged the pagan and Christian worlds, preserved fragments of Roman order, and seeded the idea of divinely ordained kingship that would shape medieval Europe for centuries. Today, the Merovingians live on in archaeology, fragmented chronicles, and cultural echoes. Their legacy, obscured by time, resurfaces in royal legends, conspiracy theories, and whispered connections to later crusading orders like the Templars. Whether as saints, sinners, or shadows of empire, the Merovingians were the first kings of what would become France, and their forgotten reign set the tone for all that followed. Even among the crowned heads of history, few dynasties have been so cloaked in legend as the Merovingians. It's their reign, which began in the shadows of Rome's fall and ended in silence centuries later. It's remembered not just for its politics or wars, but for something stranger. A myth that would cling to their name like fog to a forgotten valley. A whisper that they were not merely kings, but something more. The legend begins with Merovic, the semi-mythical founder of the Merovingian line, according to a chronicle written. Decades after his death, Merovic was born of a human woman and something else? A sea creature? Perhaps a divine beast. In some accounts, a Quinator, a beast with 5 horns, part bull, part fish, entirely unknown to natural science. The woman in question was supposedly bathing in the sea when the creature appeared and impregnated her. Whether this was allegory, invention, or sincere belief remains unclear, but the story stuck. This legend, as strange as it sounds, didn't emerge from pagan oral traditions. It came from Christian writers. Chroniclers such as Fredger, writing in the 7th century, repeated and preserved this tale. These were not outsiders mocking a dead faith. They were monastic scribes, tasked with organizing the official story of the Frankish people. The fact that they included such a myth reveals how powerful it had become, at a time when Christian Europe was still shaping its identity. Rulers were desperately seeking legitimacy, not just on the battlefield, but in the heavens. The Roman emperors had claimed divinity. Pharaohs before them were called gods. In Japan, the imperial line traced its roots to the sun goddess Amaterasu. In this context, the Merovingians were doing what many rulers had done before, weaving myth into lineage, power into blood. But the Merovingian story was different in tone. Unlike the sun-drenched divinities of the East, theirs was murkier, stranger. It was a story rooted in water, in transformation, in something beyond reason. Did not evoke glory, it suggested something occult. That ambiguity may have helped. The legend endure. Their long hair, grown uncut as a symbol of sacred kingship, reinforced the idea. To touch a Merovingian's hair, it was said, was to approach the divine. Their enemies often tried to shave them not just as humiliation, but as a political act. To remove the sacred mark was to delegitimize the king. This mixture of myth, biology, and power wasn't merely decorative. It shaped how these rulers were seen by their followers, their enemies, and even the church. Would bishops of Gaul, many of whom supported Merovingian kings, would not have done so lightly. Even if they did not believe the legend literally, they recognized its utility. It gave the kings a claim to rule that could not be challenged by mere men. Yet the church also had reason to be wary. A bloodline that claimed divine origin could one day rival the church's authority. For centuries, this tension remained unresolved, respected, but never fully embraced. The church was content to let the Merovingian mystique serve its political ends, but it never canonized it. This ambiguity only deepened after the fall of the Merovingians in the 8th century, when the Carolingians took power, starting with Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne. They deliberately sidelined Merovingian mythology. They portrayed the Merovingians as lazy, irrelevant kings, do-nothing monarchs who sat in royal carts while their mayors ruled in their place. The myth of divine blood faded, but never vanished. It lingered in secret books and half-forgotten libraries, in symbols etched into medieval churches. Centuries later, it would be reborn in the modern year, particularly the 20th century. This legend became fuel for new conspiracy theories. Fringe historians and occult writers began to link the Merovingians to the Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, even to Jesus himself. Books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail popularized the idea that the Merovingians were descendants not of sea beasts, but of Christ. That Mary Magdalene had brought a bloodline to Gaul, that this royal line had been hidden, protected, and suppressed. These ideas have no firm historical basis. The church never acknowledged them. There is no primary source connecting Merovex, line to biblical figures. But the appeal is obvious. Taps into an ancient hunger to believe that royalty is not chosen by God, but descended from God. That blood carries something eternal. The myth had simply evolved from sea beast to saviors, from pagan divinity to Christian heresy. But always with the same result. The Merovingians were not merely kings. They were vessels of something higher. It is worth noting how other divine kingships have been reinterpreted through time. Egyptian pharaohs, once worshipped as gods, were later seen as tyrants or madmen. A Japanese emperor, once untouchable, became a constitutional figure after World War II. The divine right of kings crumbled across Europe as revolutions rose. And yet, the Merovingian mystique remains strangely intact. Why? Perhaps because they disappeared. Their dynasty ended not with revolution or scandal, but with silence. The last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was deposed, shaved, and sent to a monastery. No execution, no rebellion. Just erasure. And in that silence, myth grew. Today, the Merovingians occupy a strange space in historical memory. Too early to be medieval, too late to be Roman, too real to be myth, too strange to be history. They exist in the margins between pages, between facts. But always there, their bloodline, whether sacred or symbolic, set a precedent. The idea that rulers could be more than men, that their very bodies were instruments of fate, has not entirely vanished. It echoes in royal rituals, in national myths, in the quiet awe that still surrounds crowns. In this chapter of history, we see how power and story cannot be separated. The Merovingians understood that well. They knew that swords could conquer land, but only stories could conquer time. The legend of Morvek's divine birth was more than fantasy. It was an attempt to shape reality, to claim a place above rivals beyond question. And whether we believe the tale or not, its success, it's undeniable. We're still talking about it. After all, they were kings, but more than that, they were symbols. Living myths. And perhaps that is why, even now, their name has not faded. Not entirely. In the end, the Merovingian Code is not a single secret or a buried document. It is an idea that history is not only what happened, but what we believe about what happened. That belief, passed from monk to monk, from text to text, has shaped how we see the Merovingians, not just as rulers of men, but as keepers of something forgotten, or perhaps, forbidden. Before we continue this journey, please consider supporting this channel by clicking subscribe, not just to walk with us through the hidden corridors of history, but to help keep this kind of deep, immersive storytelling alive. In a world crowded with noise, your single subscription is like a candle lit among the shadows of an archive filled with memory and silence. Thank you for listening with patience and with heart. In the early centuries of post-Roman Gaul, a remarkable transformation occurred. Kings were no longer mere rulers, they were sacred. The Merovingian dynasty wove divine authority into every coronation, alliance, and decree. It was a calculated fusion of power and holiness. A synthesis that granted legitimacy and stability, but also invited danger and division. The foundation of this sacred kingship lay in ritual. When Clovis I embraced Nicene Christianity around 496 AD, he did more than convert. He introduced the concept of an anointed ruler, ordained by God and recognized by his earthly representatives. Clovis was baptized by Bishop Remigius in Reims, a moment chroniclers emphasized not simply as a personal faith decision, but as a demonstration of divine will. From that ceremony, the king became God's lieutenant on earth, a messenger and protector of the church. Subsequent Merovingian kings continued this ritual tradition. Anointings took place with consecrated oil, derived from the holy oil tradition of the church itself. The oil, interpreted as a physical conduit of God's grace, was kept under strict ecclesiastical control. The act of anointing was not symbolic. It elevated the monarch's status, provided divine sanction for his rule, and bound the church's authority to his throne. Being anointed spelled both power and peril. The church's blessing came with expectations. Kings ruled not only by birthright, but by sacred mandate. They were expected to uphold Christian orthodoxy, support clergy, and act with piety. In return, bishops and archbishops provided religious legitimacy, counsel, and international clout. However, the relationship between Merovingian royalty and ecclesiastical authorities was never entirely stable. Church officials recognized the political capital in royal favor. Bishops often aligned with rival claimants when the king faltered. Meanwhile, kings knew that control over the church meant consolidating power. The interplay between spiritual authority and secular authority was subtle and tense, each side aware of the other's ability to undercut legitimacy. This balance extended beyond rituals into governance. Merovingian courts blended sacred symbolism with legal authority. Kings held court in wooden basilic-like halls, where shape and ceremony mattered as much as edicts. Queens, whether Frankish or Galorman, wielded informal power. Clotilde, wife of Clovis for example, helped convert him and may have influenced church appointments. Later queens acted as patrons of monasteries and intercessors in political disputes. The law code known as the Lex Salica was promulgated under Clovis's successors, combined Roman legal traditions with Germanic custom. It regulated property inheritance, tribal disputes, and crimes. In several cases, the code emphasized religious observance. Fines could be reduced if the offender donated to a monastery. Religious protections applied to clergy. Sanctuary custom was observed. Law and holiness blurred. Merovingian Rulers also used religious symbolism in coinage and architecture. Coins minted under Childeric I display Christian imagery Chiro symbols that echoed the anointing ritual. Church construction, initially modest pre-Roman basilicas, expanded into stone foundations with AFCs and crypts. These ecclesiastical structures underscored the sacred center of Merovingian power. Yet this marriage of church and monarchy was fragile. Kings often intervened in episcopal appointments. Rivals would accuse each other of impiety or heresy to diminish legitimacy. When Clovis died in 511, his kingdom was divided among 4 sons. Disputes erupted, not just over land, but over who carried the divine flame. Alba the Great was anointed in one city, Chilbert in another, with rival bishops and clerics declaring support. It was a dormant civil war lit by the language of holiness. Even when Merovingian kings were young or weak, their anointed status prevented outright deposition. Instead, nobles or mayors of the palace manipulated power behind the throne. In the 7th century, kings like Dagobert II became figureheads, religious symbols, while true political control rested in palace officials. The sacred exceeded the secular in appearance, even if substance shifted. Church authorities did not always oppose this trend. They could use sacred rule to direct actual governance. Saint Gregory of Tours, writing in the late 6th century, portrays Merovingian kings as divinely ordained but morally fallible. Religious narrative emphasized the king's Christian duty care for the poor, its protection of the church, and combat against heresy. When kings failed those duties, chroniclers offered subtle critique highlighting excess or brutality. The underlying assumption: sacred power entails moral responsibility. This heightened scrutiny demonstrates why mixing myth and monarchy was dangerous. Power enhanced religious authority, while religious authority could delegitimize a king who misused it. A king could rule by sacred right, but only as long as he upheld the moral code it implied. Over time, this tension contributed to the dynasty's decline. In the 7th century, as kings weakened, church officials suggested reforms. They frowned upon the Merovingians' violent fratricide, their pagan customs in private, and their political fragmentation. Bishops increasingly supported mayors rather than immature or ineffective kings. The church's shifting alliances signaled a pragmatic turn. A sacred kingship that failed its responsibilities could be replaced. The eventual eclipse of the Merovingian line in favor of the Carolingians was partly a political shift. It's partly theological. The church hand Pope Zachary supported Pepin, the Short's claim to become king. It's bypassing the Merovingian child, Childeric III. In doing so, the church legitimized a new sacred lineage, affirming that divine anointing was revocable when the king failed his spiritual duties. The story of Merovingian sacred authority ends where Carolingian power begins, and the consequences echo. It demonstrates how divine mythology could sanctify rule, impose moral standards, and just as easily be wielded to justify removal when those standards were violated. Merovingian sacred kingship was no mere pageant. It shaped diplomacy, lawmaking, architecture, and religious reform. It linked Rome's legacy with Germanic tradition, turning former tribal chieftains into Christian monarchs. The consecrated oil, the healing touch of kings, the symbols on coins all became tools of power. They also set expectations. Kings were not above the law, they embodied it. The weight of the crown was heavy with obligation. In the centuries that followed, the Merovingians would be brushed aside, their myths exploited, and their legacy buried. But the idea that kingship could be sacred persisted. Now, Charlemagne would wear the imperial crown not merely as a conqueror, but as a Christian emperor, resurrecting the Roman ideal. In that resurrection, echoes of Merovingian consecration remained. The church retained that model of sacred monarchy long after the last long-haired king was gone. It became part of the medieval political fabric. Kings anointed at Reims, monarchs claiming divine rights, and coronations in cathedrals broadcast to ruled lands. Movies and novels might obscure it in romantic imagery, but the Merovingians started it not for legend, but for necessity. They were the first to blend power and holiness in post-Roman Europe. They raise the crown to stand between earthly and divine, knowing that power is fragile when faith is required to reinforce it. And when faith failed, so could the king. When the last Merovingian king was deposed, it was not by the sword of a rival warlord, but by the pen and the blessing of the Pope. This was not a popular overthrow, but a calculated betrayal by the institution that had once made the Merovingians sacred. How did Rome turn on a dynasty it had elevated? Why were once anointed kings dismissed as do-nothing monarchs? And how did the Church, seizing the moment, crown its new favorite, the Carolingians? In the May 8th century, the Merovingian dynasty ruled in name only. Since the early 7th century, real power had been held by mayors of the palace, senior officials, who governed the realm's day-to-day affairs while kings faded into symbolic figureheads. Among these administrators, one line emerged dominant: the Arnulfings, later known as the Carolingians. Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace in Austrasia, wielded the iron hammer between 718 and 741. He halted Islamic expansion at the Battle of Tours in 732, forging a reputation as defender of Christendom. Yet he never assumed the title of king. That he left for his son Pepin, the short Charles Martel's son. Inherited power around 741. He governed effectively, commanding armies, restoring order, supporting missionary activity, and extending Frankish influence across Gaul. But his legitimacy rested not on genealogy, but on results. In contrast, the Merovingian king Childeric III reigned nominally from 743 to 751. He had no real command, no military accomplishments, and no influence beyond ceremonial protocols. Kingship had become a hallowed title. Into this void stepped both strategic advantage and ecclesiastical opportunity. Pope Zachary, newly installed in 741, presided over a church keen on securing military alliance and moral leadership. If Rome's image was at stake, particularly with threats from Lombards in Italy and internal instability, it needed a ruler who could protect the faith. Pippin, more than Childeric, fit that role. Historical records tell us Pope Zachary sent an envoy to Pippin, asking a question that changed the course of Frankish history. Who ought to be king? Is the one who possesses the power, or the one who does not? Pippin's response was clear and calculated. The man who held power should be king. Coop's answer, similarly, authorized action. Coop didn't read sure to legitimize this change, aligning spiritual authority with secular reality. On July 28, 751, the anointing took place in a chapel in Soissons. Pepin was crowned by Saint Boniface, the missionary bishop of Mainz, and later anointed by bishops with holy oil. His wife, Bertrude of Leon, was crowned alongside him. The act was profoundly symbolic. Holy Scripture told of God choosing kings. Through anointing Saul, then David. Here was a new Christian monarchy, born from ecclesiastical authority, replacing a dynasty that had lost both eyes and will. What followed was the quiet removal of child Eric III. Stripped of his long hair, tonsured, and forced into monastic obscurity, he disappeared from political memory. Thus ended the longest direct line of Frankish kings. The label do-nothing king was not kingmakers insulted, was the chronicler's judgment. Merovingian kings had become relics, preserved for ceremony, but irrelevant in substance. Church and nobles came to accept the shift, because the church had defined the new narrative with Pepin, now king and, backed by both papal legitimacy and military success. The Carolingians cemented their position. Pippin secured papal protection. In return, he provided military aid to Rome against the Lombards. The donation of Pepin granted to the Pope in 756 created the Papal States. The Church gained temporal territory, and Pepin gained political legitimacy. Within Christendom, it was a mutual patronage, cementing an alliance not merely of politics, but of theology. The Church's betrayal of the Merovingians was thus twofold: political convenience and theological reframing. Merovingian sacred kingship had decayed. Merovingians defined a new sacred model: territorial defender, church builder, anointed by holy hands. As Pope Zachary's decision reframed rite as effective, reducing hereditary divine blood to empty ritual, if unsupported by action, historical memory followed. Chronicles, written in monasteries, began to recast Merovingian rule as decadent, weak, and ineffective. By comparison, the Carolingian dynasty was depicted as vigorous, holy, and reforming. This was not accidental. Monasteries had funded Carolingian projects, and Carolingian kings patronized religious institutions in return. Monastic scribes shaped histories, editing older Merovingian documents, suppressing embarrassing episodes like internal strife or fragile trade networks, and amplifying Carolingian victories and church building. History became a tool for legitimacy, not just memory. Architecture absorbed this shift. Merovingian basilicas and relic sites faded in prestige. Carolingian builders opted for new style stone chapels, grander cathedrals associating divine kingship with monumental permanence. The old wooden throne rooms, the moss-covered royal tombs, the early crypts, they became relics, not centers of power. The Carolingian system would ramp up. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 by Pope Leo III, fused sacred kingship and empire. But this imperial model built atop foundations laid by Pepin and endorsed by Zachary. The betrayal of the Merovingians made room for an empire with theological sanction. Why did the church betray its sacred clients? Because holiness without power was unsustainable. Merovingian kings had symbolic divinity, but when they ceased to govern effectively, the church withdrew support. The redeployment of sacred kingship to the Carolingians was not betrayal of Christianity yet, was a recalibration. Divine authority had to be coupled with governance. In hindsight, the transition marked the evolution of sacramental monarchy. Legitimacy would come through papal blessing rather than bloodline. The kings were still anointed. But their purpose, it changed from incarnating ancient myths to enforcing Christian order. The consequences echoed through medieval Europe. In France, kings would be anointed at Reims, their authority deriving from both royal lineage and ecclesiastical blessing. The doctrine of divine right that the monarch derived authority directly from God, but subject to ecclesiastical sanction, grew from this model. Kingship was no longer tribal inheritance, it was sacral service recognized by church and church. Hierarchy learned how to crown kings without fear of losing power. For the Merovingians, fingerprints of power lingered faintly in the relic chambers, in those few carved tombs in genealogical rumors. But public memory was altered. A dynasty once sacred became a background for a new regime. Modern historians debate whether this church-mediated transition was conservative or revolutionary. In some sense, it preserved the idea of a Christian monarchy. In another, it overthrew an entire bloodline using theology. The sacred king became a managed king. The divine lineage became the divine mission. The betrayal is both political and symbolic. The church prioritized the protection of its institution and the kingdom over loyalty to any dynasty. Maintained spiritual continuity while changing. Secular phases. This calculated shift ensured stability for Western Christendom, but at the cost of ancestral memory. The Merovingian kings became myths, not rulers. Their legacy survives today not in powerful empires, but in trace names on coins, in whispered genealogies, in architectural ruins. The church's betrayal erased their authority, but not their mystique. Power and holiness remained entangled, but now with a discipline. Kings served power through church, and church governed presence through king. The Merovingians had merged sacred ritual and tribute when they failed to sustain both. Rome cleaned the slate. In supplanting them, the church preserved the principle, even as it released the bloodline. In doing so, it set a course for medieval Europe, a sacred kingship managed by papal will, not by ancestral myth. Long after the last Merovingian king faded from power, another group emerged from medieval shadows, the Knights Templar. Founded with the church's blessing, they were guardians of pilgrims and protectors of holy sites. Yet early whispers painted a deeper purpose, safeguarding secrets rooted in an older sacred lineage. How did this order come to be linked not just to Crusader piety but to the mythic Merovingian bloodline itself? The Templars were established in 1119 or 1120 at the dawn of the Crusades. Hugues de Payens, a Burgundian noble and 8 fellow Knights approached King Baldwin II at Jerusalem and Patriarch Warmond of Jerusalem to form a brotherhood charged with protecting its pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Their modest mission quickly took on weight. Supported by Bernard of Clairvaux, their reputation and membership grew. They gained papal recognition at the Council of Troyes in 1129. Their white mantles, marked with a red cross, became symbols of holy purpose and warrior discipline. Templars amassed property, wealth, and political influence across Christendom. They established fortresses, built banks, lent money to nobles and kings, and became a financial powerhouse of the medieval world. By the early 14th century, their fortunes had soared, but such power enticed envy. Long before their fall, legends attached to the Templars suggested that their remit extended beyond earthly treasure. One recurring theme: they guarded relics or even secrets connected to a sacred bloodline. Speculative claims hold that through contact with Eastern Christian traditions or access to secret manuscripts within Jerusalem, the Templars protected knowledge of a divine lineage, sometimes tied to the Merovingians, who themselves were rumored to descend from ancient royalty or Christ himself. These theories find their modern origin in 20th century works. It's not in medieval records. In 1982, Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln published The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, reviving speculation that the Merovingian dynasty was rooted in a secret line descending from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. They introduced the Priory of Sion myth, claiming this secret society founded the Templars to serve as guardians of the bloodline and sought to restore Merovingian power. None of these claims are corroborated by medieval sources. Historians classify the Priory of Sion as a modern fabrication. It's primarily created by Pierre Plantard in the 1950s and perpetuated through forged documents known as the Dossier Secrets. Still, speculative narrative connected to legendary groups historically separated by centuries. Medieval Templar records themselves do not reference Merovingian relics or bloodline claims. Their primary mission remained pilgrimage protection, charismatic Christian discipline, and military religious duties. Yet in popular culture, I've seen in novels like the Da Vinci Code their image expanded into guardians of deeper mysteries, including the Sangreal, a wordplay of Holy Grail and royal blood. Architectural symbols also attracted modern theorists. The Templars built abbeys and cloisters across France with faded carvings and heraldry some say echo Merovingian motifs. In reality, stonework variations, architectural evolutions, and regional artisans account for stylistic similarities. There is no evidence these were deliberate tributes to a bloodline. What's valuable is what this reveals about legacy. Templars. Dissolution on October 13, 1307. By order of King Philip IV and Pope Clement V, accused of heresy, idolatry, and secret rituals, became fertile ground for myth. The order's sudden suppression, the dramatic trials of Jacques d'Aumale and Jacques. The absence of full public records left gaps easily filled by speculation. For centuries, these gaps invited reinterpretation. Pious knights became conspirators. Official banknotes became covers for arcane secrets. Scholars point out that the Templars had access to texts from Jerusalem. But these were theological, legal, or monastic writings. No documents suggest lineage claims or relics tied to dynastic succession. Nor do contemporary sources link them to Jesus or Merovingian legends. The seductive power of myth, however, endures. As one blog states, Templars were protectors of the bloodline of Christ. The descendants of the Merovingians, a vivid claim unsupported by documented fact, but persistent in popular imagination. The lasting appeal lies in narrative, not in evidence. The Templars, like the Merovingians, inhabited a threshold between history and legend. When institutions fall or transform, myths rise. A warrior monk's order became knights of mystery. A fallen dynasty became the seed of conspiracy. Combined, the two become emblematic, the protectors and the progenitors of a hidden truth in truth. The Templars were an ecclesiastical military order whose faith, discipline, financial acumen made them indispensable land dangerous to medieval power networks. Their rise, influence, and fall illustrate the complex dynamics of church, monarchy, and military religious authority. Their association with sacred bloodlines emerged much later, through reinterpretation, fiction, and speculative historians. Today, the Templar-Merovingian connection remains a modern myth layered over medieval history. It reflects our longing for hidden continuity, a meaning beyond recorded chronicles. But in real history, no secret texts, no recovered relics, only the Templars' own documented legacy of valor, vocation, finance, and the dramatic collapse that still captures our curiosity. In 1982, a single self-published book ignited a modern legend that bound together sacred bloodlines, secret societies, and the allure of a hidden Jesus. The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. It's written by Michael Begent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. Presented a thesis that took the world by storm, that Jesus Christ married Mary Magdalene and fathered descendants whose lineage continued through the Merovingian dynasty. The authors claimed these descendants were protected by the Knights Templar and hidden by a clandestine organization called the Priory of Sion. Whether these claims were scholarly history or sensational fiction, their impact reshaped Merovingian legacy in popular imagination. The authors framed their argument around several key elements. They used published documents, some archival records, and speculative genealogies to argue that a sacred bloodline had survived for centuries. Carispace medievalist Pierre Plantard claimed to be a key member of the Priory of Sion, real organization founded in 1956 but later turned out to be a forger. Still, his purported documents, known as the Dossier Secrets, were deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale. These included genealogical charts linking Plantard to the Merovingians and lists of supposed Grand Masters of the Priory, including Isaac Newton and Victor Hugo. Although these claims were exposed as fabrications, they infused the conspiracy narrative with a veneer of historical aura. The thesis also leaned heavily on interpretations of architecture, especially at Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, and symbols in French abbeys. Taken out of context, these images were seen as coded references to the Grail or divine bloodlines. The book suggested that symbols, iconography, and even the shape of the chapel hinted at Christ's lineage. These interpretations sparked fierce debate. Art historians and theologians pushed back, pointing to multiple possible meanings for symbols like the chalice or dove. In medieval art, ambiguity was often intentional but not necessarily conspiratorial. Still, the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail reached public consciousness at the right time. The late 20th century saw a revival in alternative spiritualities, Gothic fiction, and conspiracy culture. This book bridged medieval history with contemporary fascination for secret knowledge. Television documentaries, radio programs, and literary clubs debated whether the early church had suppressed the truth about Christ's descendants, whether factual or fictional. The narrative captured imaginations. In 2003, Don Brown's The Da Vinci Code brought the myth to global bestseller status. It reimagined the case vividly: secret societies, cryptic codes, the Priory of Sion, and the truth of Jesus' legacy hidden beneath centuries of religious control. Brown's novel drew heavily on Holy Blood, mixing art history, Renaissance symbolism, and Russell Crowe style revelation. The result was explosive. Viewers and readers began to imagine Merovingian kings as heirs of sanctified blood, not merely Frankish rulers. Churches, abbeys, and even tourism campaigns responded. Rosslyn Chapel sold more tickets. Whispers about Rennes-le-Château revived local myths. The term Grail line became part of everyday conversation. But historians remained grounded. In documentary evidence, the Priory of Sion was proven a hoax. No credible document supports Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene or survival after crucifixion. There is no lineage from Christ to any medieval ruler. In addition, the Templars. Suppression in the early 14th century was grounded in politics and debt to King Philip IV of France. No records show them protecting Merovingian relics. Medieval chroniclers and church records of Jerusalem, Cluny, or Chartres never mention Grail lines or hidden descendants. Yet the myth achieved something fact-based. Dynasties struggled to hold. Narrative immortality. The Merovingians, long consigned to dusty history books, were suddenly at the center of global intrigue. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels dramatized their lineage, feeding viewers with dramatized visuals, maps, and symbolic art. The phrase Holy Blood, Holy Grail became shorthand for suppressed truth and secret lineage. The myth, altered more than the Merovingians' place in historical memory, recontextualized the Templars too. It's no longer just crusading knights and bankers. They were reimagined as keepers of sacred relics and secret trust. Their symbols, that divine. Geometry, twin columns, red cross were reinterpreted as encoded messages, not just Christian iconography. Even the story of Jacques de Molay, the Templar Grand Master burned in 1314 by order of Pope Clement V and King Philip IV, gained apocalyptic resonance. In the fiction, Molay's final curse was rewritten as a call to restore the sacred bloodline. As a result, the Church's sacred bloodline concept, once theological metaphor, became a conspiracy staple. The myth spread across Christian and secular audiences, from Christian bookstores to occult forums. It blurred lines between faith, history, and entertainment. At the same time, the myth spurred renewed academic curiosity. Scholars began re-examining Merovingian genealogies, Merovingian art, and the formation of medieval Christian identity. While they dismissed the supernatural claims, they argued that the real story was how Christendom used lineage and ritual to legitimize power. The fact that a myth could spark such widespread belief revealed something about the human need for hidden roots and higher purpose. It's important to acknowledge that Holy Blood authors did not claim to have discovered definitive proof. They framed their hypothesis cautiously. But their blend of medieval genealogy, alleged suppressed sources, and speculative interpretation invited readers to imagine secrets behind the layers of official history. The impact of the myth went further. For Francophone conspiracy culture, the Merovingians became avatars of sovereignty suppressed. For New Age spiritual seekers, Mary Magdalene's bloodline offered a feminine complement to institutional patriarchy. For historical fiction and thrillers, the myth provided structure, urgency, and stakes, became a template. Secret archives, conspiracy, sacred artifacts, woman in danger, chase across Europe. Brown's novel followed it precisely. Where facts end and fiction begins, the line is often porous. Medievalists, genealogists, and religious scholars stress that the strength of a narrative is not evidence. A dead doesn't stop its stay in popular memory. The myth of the Merovingian bloodline remains potent because it connects Christianity's beginning with modern doubt and hope. It evokes a King Arthur-style longing for lost sanctity, a yearning for spiritual restoration. Several institutions responded. The BBC aired a documentary that compared the manuscript evidence with the novel's claims, highlighting gaps. The Louvre and Musée de Cluny mounted exhibitions devoid of Grail mythology, focusing on art and real religious heritage. Yet private tours in Normandy, Rennes Chateau, and South France spent more time referencing Da Vinci Code myths than medieval charters. For all the distraction, the myth also sparked research interest. Some historians used the attention to draw viewers back to actual Merovingian history, their legal system, burial sites such as the Basilica tomb at St. Denis, their role in European state formation. In that sense, the myth became a double-edged sword. It overshadowed facts, but also shone a spotlight. Today, the legacy of Holy Blood and the Da Vinci Code endures in quiet corners of the internet. Coffee table debates and hidden histories. But academically, the Merovingians are increasingly appreciated for who they were. Frankish rulers shaping early medieval Europe, bridging Roman legacy and medieval Christendom. They were not descended from Christ because Christ left no descendants, but they were descendants of history in motion. They built a kingdom that became Europe. The displacement of sangreal fantasies by verifiable fact may continue, and yet the myth endures. It taught the world that buried dynasties and secret histories could feel real if you presented them with the right clues. Fiction met conspiracy and the world listened. But now, we must learn from both what was known and what was powerful enough to be believed. Long before the word forgotten took its weight in historical memory, The Merovingian legacy was silenced not through overt destruction, but by a persistent erasure that lingers in the stone and mortars of Europe's sacred sites. Churches were erected over royal burial grounds. Archives were allowed to decay or disappear, and whole chapters of history were recast or dismissed. The result, a dynasty once central to early medieval Europe became, for many, a footnote and enigma in the foundation stones of the church and the state. One of the most telling examples lies near Paris, the Basilica of Saint Denis. Excavations in recent years have uncovered at least 60 remarkably preserved plaster sarcophagi, dating from the Merovingian era, buried beneath layers of later construction. These sarcophagi suggest that the site originally served as a necropolis for Frankish royalty and aristocrats, predating the high Gothic structure standing today. The churchette's foundations, rebuilt repeatedly over centuries, transformed the Merovingian burial ground into a site of Christian pilgrimage, with the early kings buried inside, largely forgotten in the walls beneath. In Dijon, beneath the Romanesque Church of St. Philibert, archaeologists recently uncovered a sequence of burials dating from the Merovingian and even Roman periods. Each layer of construction, each foundation, erased the visible markers of earlier Frankish dynasties. Over time, stone coffins, once markers of dynasty and power, were reduced to archaeological footnotes hidden from view. These building practices mirrored a cultural imperative. Christianizing the landscape meant constructing new narratives atop old ones. Merovingian royal cemeteries evolved into Christian shrines, preserving sanctity while burying dynastic identity. At Jouarre Abbey, near Paris, Merovingian crypts still survive. Carved stone sarcophagi from the 7th century lie beneath later. Churches and sermons in the Middle Ages turned the focus toward saints and abbesses, not kings. The sacred remained, but the royal significance faded. The decision to suppress Merovingian heritage was not always malicious. Often, it was pragmatic. During the Carolingian rise in the 8th century, the new dynasty sought theological legitimacy via anointing at Reims, Clovis' own baptism site, but did so under a new narrative. While earlier church traditions linked Frankish legitimacy with Merovingian lineage, Carolingian chroniclers recast those kings as bygone relics of broken rule. The do-nothing king's narrative, articulated in Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, portrays the late Merovingians as inert figureheads, overshadowed by efficient mayors of the palace. It was a textbook of historical rewriting, serving power, consolidation. At the same time, Merovingian-built works gradually disappeared. Many early basilicas and baptisteries such as Saint-Étienne in Paris were demolished or rebuilt, often during the 12th century when Gothic ascendancy reshaped ecclesiastical architecture. Art and architecture erased layers of memory. Merovingian predecessors convoked by Franciscan or Norman patronage were physically removed from view. Their relics perhaps transferred, their foundations incorporated into later structures without acknowledgement. Written records suffered the same fate. During the chaotic early medieval centuries, few documents recorded the reigns of Merovingian kings in detail. Few original charters survive. Much of what we know comes from later historians, often with Carolingian bias or the hagiography of saints overshadowing ruling families. Even Conrad von Megenberg, centuries later, lamented that Merovingian genealogy disappeared because of poor scribal transmission and deliberate omission by Carolingian scribes. The result was a triple erasure: architectural obscuring, textual neglect, and political dismissal. The Merovingians became the silent kings, our legacy mediated only through burial sites, skeletal artifacts, and scattered chronicles reinforced in the popular mind by myth and revivalists, not by continuous historical tradition. Then, question remains: why suppress a lineage that could claim divine approval and foundational state building? Part of the answer lies in the evolving role of kingship. Powerful Carolingians wanted to align legitimacy with papal authority under new scripts. They needed to make their rules seem not a continuation of Merovingian misrule, but a renewal of Christian governance. To do that, they buried their predecessors in shadow. Another factor: Christian sensibilities themselves prized humility. Royal excess, internal violence, dynastic division, all common in Merovingian rule, conflicted with monastic ideals. who controlled textual production, preferred saints, bishops, and moral kings, not those stained by internecine warfare. Suppressing Merovingian details allowed a new moral narrative to govern spiritual memory. Yet, our fascination with Merovingian identity continues through archaeological rediscoveries. Its genealogical speculation and artistic remnant, Asand, Juar. At former Frankish crypts, the physical past persists despite attempts at erasure. Scholars excavating plaster sarcophagi and scions of tombs restore not just bones, but insight into politics, elites, art, and belief. Unanswered questions linger. Where were most royal Merovingian graves? Were they all relocated into abbeys? Did commoners remember them in folk memories beyond official chronicles? Many manuscripts were destroyed in Carolingian rewritings, or lost in Viking raids, Norman destruction, and early modern desecration. In rediscovering Merovingian architecture baptisteries in Poitiers, structures in Metz re-examined plans beneath Notre Dame's collars, pieced together the lost dynasty's imprint. Each artifact, each foundational stone, whispers a legacy churches tried to forget but could never fully expunge. For modern listeners, the suppressed legacy reminds us, history is sculpted by those who write it. To that end, our mission is not nostalgia, is restoration of memory, not through legend, but through evidence. The Merovingians may have been shunned by medieval chroniclers, but they live on in tombs, crypts, stones, and silent sarcophagi. Their memory awaits revival not through myth, but through archaeology, through manuscripts, through the patient reconstruction of what was buried in silence. Centuries after the Merovingian kings vanished from power, fragments of their legacy endured not in grand monuments or public records, but in faint symbols, coded motifs, and whispered genealogies. The long-haired Frankish monarchs left behind resonance in bees, rings, architecture, and nobility lines that would later fuel speculation, search for identity, and the architecture of secret societies. These traces are subtle, but their persistence invites deeper discovery. One of the most distinctive symbols associated with Merovingian identity is the bee. Excavations at late Merovingian graves in Saint Denispri's royal necropolis have uncovered gold signet rings, belt buckles, and ornamental fabric embossed with bees and fleur-de-lis patterns. Bees were royal insects, signifying immortality, resurrection, and regal authority. The emergence of the fleur-de-lis three-petaled lily in Merovingian objects around the same time marks the earliest known use of this emblem in the region. Though later adopted by the Capetians, the lily's Merovingian roots suggest continuity of symbolism and possibly an early form of dynastic branding. Hair itself functioned as symbol. The long hair of Merovingian kings was not fashionate, was an insignia of divine legitimacy. To cut a king's hair was to cut his right to rule. Childeric, the third's tonsure, ordered by Pepin the Short in 751, was a deliberate act of dethronement. The logic was simple. Stripped of hair, the king was stripped of holiness. The cutting of ritual hair had biblical precedent in Samson's story. Hair symbolized divinely granted power. Merovingian long hair echoed that power. Recorded in chronicles, like Gregory of Tours, it became a living emblem of sacred lineage. These physical symbols echoed through noble genealogies. Several European royal families claimed descent, however distant from the Merovingians. The Capetians, through their female lines, asserted ancestry from Frankish origins to reinforce legitimacy. Even in more modern times, as genealogists traced aristocratic bloodlines across centuries, the Merovingians appeared as ancestral roots in ambiguous genealogical charts. Though often tenuous, the lure of an ancient bloodline gave families a sense of continuity and prestige. These connections played into the narratives of secret societies, the 19th and 20th centuries. Nationalist and esoteric groups in France revived Merovingian symbolism. They used bees, fleur-de-lis, and genealogical claims as emblems. Organizations, loosely built around royalist or occult interests, presented themselves as custodians of forgotten history. Some claimed to revive the true French spirit, rooted in Merovingian kings rather than Carolingian or Capetian lines. Again, much of this is modern reinvention, but the usage of symbols amplifies the resonance of Merovingian heritage. Perhaps The most visible legacy in stone lies in architecture. Templar architecture across Europe, particularly in France and the British Isles, displays carvings and chapels with ambiguous motifs. Some researchers point to 8-pointed rosettes or double-peaked arches and link them to Merovingian symbols. In places like Temple Church in London or the round churches of Scandinavia and Jerusalem, connections are drawn between architectural geometry and ancient iconography. But architectural historians note that such features often come from common medieval designs rosettes, from Gothic rose windows, round structures inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. No direct link to Merovingians exists in medieval building plans. Still, the mythology persists. Knights Templar, castles, and chapels have become pilgrimage sites for modern esoteric researchers seeking hidden Merovingian codes. They argue that placement of bee carvings, concentric stone circles, or cryptic numbers in masonry align with genealogical tables, yet all of these interpretations arise post-fact. Medieval masons were guided by liturgical needs, local styles, and Roman building traditions, not genealogical puzzles, in early 20th century scholarship. Historian Leon Wilchin cataloged Merovingian artifacts coins, fibulae, buckles tying them to specific royal lineages. Their placement in modern museums revived interest in the dynasty's material culture. Yet fewer visitors focus on familial trees. Genetic genealogy, emerging recently, still finds no unique markers for Merovingian descent. So the symbolic echoes in heraldry and family crests remain more evocative than empirical. Revolutions and political upheaval also affected Merovingian symbolism. In the French Revolution, royalist imageries such as fleur-de-lis was banned as monarchical. The image of bees was briefly used by Napoleon. The Emperor Napoleon I adopted bees as imperial symbols to recall Merovingian dynasty, linking his regime to France's earliest royalty. The connection was explicit. Bees represented French sovereignty, unconstrained by Bourbon rule. Napoleon's symbolic choice demonstrates how Merovingian motifs can be repurposed to legitimize new authority. Even centuries later, yet, for all, the modern reuses Merovingian symbols are more relic than living language. Without extensive written records on their symbolic meaning, historians reconstruct significance from scattered artifacts and context. Cache Atoma gold bee, a carved capital, a sculpted lily resonates more through silence than documentation. At the same time, the belief in a sacred Merovingian bloodline infiltrated popular culture. Novels, TV series, and documentaries present the dynasty as guardians of holy knowledge. In genealogy websites, amateur historians list Merovingian descent as a point of pride. These uses bring lineage into personal identity. Not historical fact, but a sense of connection to ancient roots. The tension between factual history and symbolic meaning follows the same pattern seen in myth creation. Symbols persist where documentation is thin. When physical evidence surfaces, like St. Denisit's anchors memory. When words vanish, people rely on symbols, traces, genealogical clues to tell themselves who they are, to understand what the Merovingians left behind. We don't need secret traps or hidden tombs. We need to look at bees stamped on Frankish coins, hair lengths on reliquary carvings, lidded crowns in Carolingian iconography, and in the modern choices of Napoleon and revivalist groups. We look at sarcophagi buried beneath churches, and family trees embellished with names of kings long dead. The Merovingian legacy is a palimpsest, erased, rewritten, half-remembered. It survives in shards not as continuous lineage, but as coded suggestion. Whether through genetic inheritances, architectural echo, or heraldic revival, their symbols invite us to look deeper. They remind us that memory depends not only on record, but on resonance. And when that resonance speaks in bees, hair, or stone, it invites us to question what truly endures through centuries of silence. In the story of the Merovingians, fact and legend have become woven into one another with a tension that echoes across centuries. Separating historical truth from myth is not just a scholarly task, it's an excavation of collective memory. But is the truth always more valuable than the myth? And what does it say about us that we cling to stories of hidden bloodlines and sacred kings? Merovingian history begins with its foundations in the 5th century. the rise of Clovis I, the battles of Tolbiac and Vui, the conversion to Nicene Christianity, and the consolidation of Frankish power across Gaul. These events are solidly documented in contemporary sources like Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, royal charters, and the Lex Salic legal codes referencing inheritance and administration. Yet it is the mythic layer that continues to resonate. Fredegar's 7th century chronicle records the legend of Moravec's conception, his mother fathered by a sea beast or Quinitoran origin myth, that erases mundane lineage and elevates the dynasty to near-mythical status. Its mythical genealogy sits uneasily alongside real historical achievements. Wars won, laws codified, kingdoms ruled. Here, the line between legend and legacy begins to blur. Myths compress complex realities into archetypes, harnessing the symbolic to make sense of the world. As cultural memory, myths offer narratives more memorable than dry historical record. Book published centuries later. The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, 1982. Skis further offering conjecture that Jesus and Mary Magdalene produced descendants, who became the Merovingian dynasty, while entirely speculative and unverified by medieval sources. The theory captivated media and the public. The Da Vinci Code 2003 amplified the concept, removing myth from academic margins and placing it center stage in popular culture. These stories are vivid, dramatic, and sensational fuel for conspiracy. In contrast, factual history is often incremental, dispassionate, or obscure. But why tell the difference? Because myths shape identity and memory, while history shapes understanding. Merovingians matter more as myth than monarchy, because myths resonate with emotional truth. Myths offer continuity across centuries, a link to vanished grandeur. Even if Merovingian rulers no longer wear crowns, the idea of sacred bloodline endures in genealogy, in national identities, in the powerful symbolism of long hair, weaponry, and holy kingship. Historians note that the Merovingian obsession with symbols and storytelling speaks to a broader medieval need to legitimize rule in chaotic times. However, it's obscure as much as they preserve. The Priory of Sion, introduced in the mid-20th century, was later revealed as a hoax fabricated by Pierre Plantard. Its purported archives listing Merovingian heirs and famous Grand Masters were forgeries. They lent modern myths an appearance of historical authenticity. Scholars emphasize how easily myth becomes accepted when real gaps in documentation exist. Still, Merovingian history cannot be wholly reduced to myth. Battles were fought, alliances forged, law codes written. They shaped early medieval Europe, laying foundations for the Carolingian Empire and the Christian kingdoms. Without their military conquests and Christian conversion under Clovis, history in Western Europe might have unfolded differently. Legend may eclipse fact, but memory survives in both realms. People cling to hidden bloodlines because myths offer belonging, depth, and purpose. Belief in sacred lineage expresses longing for transcendent legitimacy. We may project hopes onto a past heavier with resonance than documentation. Philosophically, myth serves as a mirror of power. If we believe a king's hair contained divine authority, that belief gives the hair power. If we believe in hidden descendants of Christ, the myth exerts cultural control. Myths operate less by truth than by the influence of belief, as historian studies show. Myths simplify complex realities into symbols that endure beyond records. Thus, the Merovingians survived not because of uninterrupted dynastic rule since their lineage was replaced, but because their legend persists. Long-haired kings, divine origins, secret bloodlines. Their myth casts a shadow over chronicles, archaeology, and family names. It haunts museums, crypts, and genealogical charts. The question remains, does it matter whether myths are true or false? Yes, for our understanding of history. Myths without evidence can mislead. But they also testify to our cultural imagination. The Merovingian myth is a conduit between past and present, between rule and reverence. It reveals how societies remember and why myths hold sway when records fail. What remains is not just Merovingian DNA, but Merovingian desire for sacred kings in a fragmented world, for continuity in chaos, for meaning beyond mortality. In telling their story, we are not just recounting forgotten kings. We are examining how we remember, who we choose to remember, and why hidden lines of power continue to echo in collective memory. History ends, but imagination persists, and sometimes imagination shapes our reality. The Merovingian dynasty did not end with trumpets. It slipped away in silence beneath the rhythm of abbey bells and the murmurs of cloisters. The last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was deposed not in open war, but through ritual erased tonsured. Stripped of his long hair and sent to a monastery. Reflective of his removal, the dynasty drifted into memory, remembered by a few chroniclers, buried beneath centuries of rewritten history, and evoked only in shadowy family legends. It may be easy to imagine the final Merovingian king alone in his cell, yet historical sources paint a similar portrait of unceremony. The Frankish annals of the time, particularly the annals of Metz and Einhard's Vita, Corley Magnin, note his deposition without recording fate or burial. The omission speaks volumes. A king removed, yet not mourned. A dynasty ended, yet never officially mourned in song or ritual. It suggests that forgetting was deliberate and time would finish the job. Merovingian memory then faded into partial recovery till the 12th and 13th centuries. References to the dynasty were sparse, yet some monastic saints in Spire of Fontenelle or Saint Arnulf of Metz died, spiritual lineage to early Frankish tradition. The hagiographies preserved fragments, but as later medieval poetry grew, genealogies prioritized Capetian descent, emphasizing continuity with earlier dynasties not over Merovingians, but instead weaving linearity into a national myth. And yet the question lingers: if a lost Merovingian bloodline continues today through female descendants or a distant noble family's possession of that lineage would mean little. Without tradition or public recognition, how would you know? There are indeed black-clothed historians tracing genealogies through fragmentary records, capital names, marriage contracts, church archives, but no crown, no ceremony, no portrait marks their place. This disappearance illuminates the fragility of legacy. History often favors successions marked by ceremony, not by blood. Charlemagne's rise, for example, sealed the Carolingian tradition with coronations and imperial ritual. The Merovingians, by contrast, relied on legend and bloodline but lost the administrative underpinning that might cement remembrance. Their story reminds us that legacy can be imagined as much as inherited. The myths we remember, the artifacts. The name itself, Merovingian, remains potent in our imagination precisely because it became hidden. It became treasure for later generations of historians, antiquarians, and storytellers. Out of silence, curiosity grows, and with curiosity, memory reawakens. Today, we walk among their markers. Crypts beneath basilicas, bees carved into old stones, sarcophagi beneath Gothic floors, and genealogies that mention names in passing. But no voice is read. From ancient script, no symbols call out Merovingian. The dynasty once revered, erased, and then rediscovered survives, perhaps not on records, but on echoes. And so, for those who lie wakeful in the silent night, ask yourself, if the Merovingians still walk among us, unannounced, rooted in centuries. Of forgotten heritage would we ever know? Would history record them? Or would time, again, bury them in plain sight? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who's ready to see beyond the surface. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories the world tried to forget. Subscribe for more real history told in silence.